There was a lot of really incompetent and corrupt popes for over 200 years running. You know, when you're the person who has all authority on the planet and you really don't know what you're doing, you could have some problems. Between 800 and 1054, there was a time of real problems for many of the popes were very incompetent. By the way, why those dates? 800 is the time of Charlemagne, and 854 is the time of the Great Schism, or the Great Schism, which we'll talk about in a few moments. There were a few outstanding as well as the many who were incompetent and or corrupt. Nicholas I was a pope from 858 to 867. He held state officials accountable to very high moral standards. He was trying to do what the church is supposed to be doing. He forbade Lothair. Remember him? Lothair? He was one of the sons of the Charlemagne's grandsons. He forbade him to divorce his wife without cause. You can't do that. You know, and there's biblical precedent for the church authority to call the state authority. Wait, you can't do that. Remember John the Baptist? He challenged one of Herod the Great's sons for doing something wrong, and he lost his head for it, but he wasn't afraid to challenge them and doing the wrong thing. Lothair just wanted to change wives. He says, you can't do that. And that didn't get him any favor, I'm sure. Nicholas insisted on being the supreme authority of the church, however. He doesn't recognize Christ as being the supreme authority of the church. He was the supreme authority of the church. And that's great if you're trying to do good things, but which of us is good enough to be the supreme authority of the church? No one. When he tried to assert his authority over the church in the East, he was very unsuccessful. He did make an attempt to say, okay, let's get these two wings of the church, the East and the West, back together. And what? I'll be in charge of both. And so the people in the East went, nah, we're not going for that. We're not going for that. Something really strange happened in the year 1046. In 1046, remember how we talked about the passage in Proverbs that says 6 things the Lord hates, yes, and 7 are an abomination. We see that as a literary device in Scripture frequently to emphasize something. Well, here we're going to start this off by saying that there was a time when there was 3 popes. No, 4. Benedicting the ninth was pope. He was driven out of Rome. Variety of reasons. Probably one of the larger reasons was because a fellow named Sylvester III wanted him out, and he wanted to be pope. So Benedicting the ninth was driven out of Rome. Sylvester III took Benedictine's place. Now Benedictine is no longer the pope, but you know, news doesn't travel as fast in those days as it does today. And so he sold the papacy that he no longer had. He sold it to Gregory V. Now, this is not Gregory I. Remember, we talked about the first medieval pope, Gregory I, Gregory the Great. This isn't him. It's interesting. History sort of jumps from Gregory I to Gregory VI. Nobody cares about anybody in between so much. Even though Benedictine was no longer pope, why was he no longer pope? First, he was ousted, and second, he sold the papacy. He still insisted on being the pope. I mean, this is a guy who doesn't get it. He's been thrown out of office, one. Then after he no longer has the office, he sells the office, and he says, I still have the office. Bit of a problem. All 3, Benedictine, Sylvester, and Gregory VI, claimed to be pope at the same time. You think, how could that happen? Well, it would be harder for something like that to happen today, again, because communication is what it is today. But in those days, news traveled slow, and you could get away with a lot more stuff. Finally, another guy comes along, Henry III. He is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Again, remember, Holy Roman Empire is not the church. It is the authority over this vast majority of the lands of Europe, and it's a political governmental authority. Henry III, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he says, all right, all 3 of you guys are out of here. And he appointed Clement II. So now there's 4 popes. Well, how are we going to have 4 popes? Well, we can get back to 3 in a hurry because Clement died pretty shortly after he was made pope. So Emperor Henry appointed, he said, okay, this is it. This is done. I'm appointing my cousin Bruno. I mean, this sounds like a joke, but it's literally, so I'm appointing my cousin Bruno, and he will be Pope Leo the Ninth. Leo, now finally, of all of these 4 different popes that had been here, Clement, he didn't have enough time for us to find out whether he was good or not. But clearly, Benedictine, Sylvester, and Gregory the Sixth were not so great. But it's interesting that Leo was strong. And he was also backed by the Holy Roman Empire. Because let's remember, who appointed him to be Pope? God? No, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a political organization, Henry III, he appointed him. Leo was strong enough, because he was backed by the Holy Roman Empire, that he lasted and all of the other 3 faded out. You know, just ask you to think, man, you read the New Testament and you read what it says about those, we know how the rulers of the Gentiles operate. Those who are great lord it over people. They exercise authority over them. But no, it's not to be that way among my disciples, Jesus says. No, rather, if you want to be great, you need to be the servant of all. If you want to be the first, you need to be willing to be the last. You need to follow my example, Jesus says. I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom. You read that, and then you read this, and you think it's the same thing, right? Not so much. Not so much. This has got to be the zenith of jockeying and maneuvering for authority. Leo and his successors cemented papal authority and centralized power in Rome, centralized the ecclesiastical of the church power in Rome. Meanwhile, in the East, let's not forget, there's another part of the church's story. Meanwhile, in the East, not a lot of jockeying going on over there, because as I said a few moments back, the emperor there had authority, and the patriarch, which is the Eastern equivalent to the Pope in the West, the patriarch serves at the pleasure of the emperor, and so the government is just completely, they got the control over there. So meanwhile, in the East, things were different. Now that leads us to the great Schism or Schism, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it, of 1054. The church in the East and the church in the West, let us remember, why did the two come about? Because as the barbarians were pouring down into the Roman Empire from the north, Emperor Constantine said, uh-oh, it's time to move. And at that point in time, when Constantine, this is the 300s, when he's there, he says, let's move east. There's not much out there. It's a little bit more sparse. And he goes and he builds this brand new city. And he calls it Constantinople. His name is Constantine. He names the capital city Constantinople. Had no ego whatsoever. And I mean, it's nice to have things named after you after you're dead, but when you name things after yourself, well, maybe you're a little bit full of yourself. But at any rate, Constantine sets up Constantinople, which is today modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. The Asia Minor, which is, of course, the areas where the Apostle Paul did most of his ministry. He obviously went further west as well, but a lot of it there. Ephesus, a lot of the churches that we have letters to are from that area. Was largely Christian, but that became the eastern part of the church. After the split there, the Bishop of Rome in Italy becomes the Pope over the Western Church, and the ranking church official, the Patriarch of Constantinople, becomes the authority in the Eastern Church. But with the emperor gone, what did that vacuum gave the Pope some real authority, some real power. Again, things, we didn't have the communication, we didn't have the travel, they didn't have the communication or travel. What the Pope in the West do, it'd be months before the emperor would ever hear about it. So he began using this power. That's why more was taking place in the West, because there was no accountability, at least not as much. So the church was free to do somewhat as it pleased, continually increasing in power, which ends up creating two churches, the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And again, forgive me for being redundant, but for those who just tuned in, the Western Church, the Latin Church, the Roman Church becomes the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church of today. The Eastern Church, again, this is kind of review, is philosophically different from the church in the West. The church in the East was more Greek in its thinking. The church in the West was more Teutonic or German or Latin in its thinking. The Eastern Church allowed clergy to marry. And by this time, the Western Church was already forbidding that. The Eastern Church used the Greek language when they studied the Scriptures. The Western Church used the Latin language. And again, let me remind you, the Bible, New Testament, originally written in Greek. So what do you want to study it in if you can? The closest to the original. What happened when Jerome translated the Bible, the Old Testament Hebrew into Latin and the New Testament Greek into Latin? He made some serious mistakes. So the Latin church, the Western church, was studying the Bible that was sort of corrupted. Jerome's Latin Vulgate had some serious errors. I'm not going to go back into them. We've already discussed that in the past. Theologically, they differed as well, usually on issues that we would think of today as being rather trivial. Then came this thing called the iconoclastic controversy. This further drove a wedge. It was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. The Eastern Church had steered away from the use of images. Now listen to what I'm saying here. The Eastern Church had steered away from the use of statues for worship. The Western Church, statues. The Eastern Church, a little bit more of a conscience. They said no. They read the commandment a little bit more literally, kind of missed the point of it, but they said, we're not to make a graven image, but we can have a two-dimensional image. So they, in the East, are worshiping using icons, which are paintings. So while the Western Church has statues as a part of their worship, the Eastern Church has these icons. And if you're familiar with Greek icons, they all have a very Greek Orthodox characteristics about them, really big eyes. The perspective is not what we would call good art today. Be that as it may, what happened was they started to argue about this. One is saying, well, you use statues. Well, you use icons. And they went back and forth over this iconoclastic thing. It is noteworthy that although the Eastern Orthodox Church today does not use images, it uses icons and pictures very extensively. If you go, especially to European or Middle Eastern Greek Orthodox churches, man, there's a lot of pictures. It's also interesting, by the way, just as a footnote here, in many of these really old churches, you can barely see the pictures. Why? They're all black. Why? Soot from incense. The buildings, the insides of the buildings, you can barely make out what some of the stuff is because everything is just blackened by black lamp from burning candles, but burning incense as well. So when Western Pope Nicholas, the first, basically a good man, tried to help solve the controversy in the Eastern Church, his help was seen as interference. We don't need you to tell us what to do. These issues and a number of more caused a great division, the great schism of 1054. I say there was a few other issues, just to give you an example of other issues. One group had one form of wording for the Nicene Creed. The other group had a slightly different wording. There was, as far as content, there was no difference. You say it this way, I say it that way, well, you're going to hell. No, you're going to hell. This is kind of where things went. Of course, there was a big schism between the East and the West over the authority of the Pope. This is just another little interesting thing. The Roman Church paid more attention to Christ the Son, and the Eastern Church paid more attention to God the Father. So it's just interesting, just a different thing. Well, straw that broke the camel's back, really the straw that broke the camel's back, you want to talk about huge issues, was whether to use leavened or unleavened bread for communion. This was it. This was it. Now, again, this wasn't it. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. With back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. All right, you know what? This thing on the bread, you people are wrong. Because you use this kind of bread, we use that kind of bread. Relatively minor difference led to anathemas on both, from both. What do I mean by anathemas? condemnations, eternal damnation. You are eternally damned for what you think about the bread. No, you're eternally damned for what you think about the bread. This is exactly what Jesus had in mind when he established the church, right? Not so much. Interesting footnote to this. These anathemas were not repealed until 1965. 911 years, the East and the West saw each other as the other being condemned for their failures. The Eastern Church, ever since the schism, has sort of been locked in a time warp, from my opinion. They haven't changed much of anything in their theology, in their polity, in their methodology since 1054. They have not been effective. They've not been hardly involved in any way with missions and that kind of thing. It's sadly pathetic to me, and I would hope that it would be for you as well, that the church could be split over so many little matters as what kind of bread to use for communion. It is a testimony to what happens when religion takes the place of New Testament Christianity. And it doesn't do us any good to look back and cast stones. We can learn from that, though, and say, let's don't go there. The Western Church has been more influential in the world than the Eastern Church, but much of its influence, as we saw in this chapter, wasn't good. Yeah, they expanded, they got more powerful, they got more land, got more money. But was that really what the point of the church was all about? Both the Eastern and the Western churches have been more religious than Christian for most of the time. And we say, even as we read in the scriptures, even so, Lord Jesus, come quickly. 911 years division between the Eastern and Western churches. 6 things the Lord hates. No, 7 an abomination. One of them is one who sows discord among the brethren. The Apostle Paul scolds the church of Corinth. I hear there's divisions among you. Not good. Then the Apostle Paul writes to Titus and says, listen, if there's a divisive man, warn him once, warn him twice, and then boot him. Can't have division in the church. So, was there a lot of advances during this period? Yeah, most of them bad. Was there a lot of division? Yeah, and that was really bad. May we learn from these things. May we learn from these things and only make advances biblically and refuse to be divisive. Hope that's helpful.